They invited her to witness her own humiliation. Her son, a 52-year-old man in a $1,000 suit, called after 20 years of silence, not to apologize, but to ensure she would sit there in her luxurious Manhattan law office and watch him take everything he believed was his. She was 78. She lived alone in a small house in suburban Austin, and in his eyes, she had long been dead, just not yet dead. But he was wrong. If you love stories of justice, dignity, and the truth finally being revealed, subscribe to the channel now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. Like and comment the city or country you're watching in so I know where in the world my story has reached. Now, let me tell you what really happened. I want to tell you something about silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind you find on a Sunday morning when the coffee is hot and the light comes through the window at the right angle and you think, just for a second, that everything is going to be okay. No. I'm talking about a different kind of silence. The kind that gets built up over years, brick, by people who decide that you don't matter anymore. The kind that settles into your bones so slowly you don't even notice it happening until one day you wake up and realize you've gone 20 years without anyone calling your name the way they used to. That was my life. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 78 years old, and until the morning Marcus called, I had made my peace with being forgotten. I live outside Austin, about 40 minutes from the city, down a county road that floods every other spring and loses power whenever a real storm rolls through. The farmhouse isn't much. 3 bedrooms, 2 of which I don't use. A kitchen that still has the original linoleum from 1974, and a back porch where I sit every evening with a glass of iced tea and watch the sun go down over the dry grass. My neighbors are a cattle rancher named Dale, who waves at me from his truck but never stops, and a younger couple 2 properties over who I've never actually spoken to in the 4 years they've lived there. I'm not telling you this because I want your pity. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand exactly who I was on the morning of April 14th, before everything changed. I was a woman who had learned to ask for nothing. It wasn't always that way. Once upon a time, I had a career, a real one. I spent nearly 30 years as an interior designer, not the kind who picks out throw pillows for people who can't decide between beige and cream, but the serious kind. The kind who gets called in when a company is building its headquarters and wants every square foot to say something about who they are. I worked with architects. I worked with developers. I worked with men who ran companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars and women who had clawed their way to the top of industries that didn't want them there. I was good at it. I won't pretend otherwise, but I'm also not going to pretend that my career was the most important thing I ever did. It wasn't. The most important thing, and I say this with no pride, only the kind of tired honesty that comes from being very old and having very little left to protect, was the decision I made in the winter of 1999. A decision that saved a family fortune, destroyed my marriage, cost me my son, and buried me under 20 years of silence that I had no idea how to dig my way out of. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The morning Marcus called, I was in the workroom. I had taken up furniture restoration after I left New York. It started as something to do with my hands, a way to fill the hours that had suddenly become enormous and empty and a little frightening. But it turned into something more. There is something deeply satisfying about taking a chair that someone threw in a dumpster, broken leg, water damage, fabric worn down to bare threads, and making it whole again. Nobody applauds you for it. Nobody writes about it. You just do it. And at the end, you have something that works again, something that has its dignity back, and that is enough. I was sanding the arm of a walnut side chair, circa 1940s, when the phone rang. I don't get many calls. My sister Patricia calls every Sunday, and sometimes my neighbor Dale calls if the road is flooded and he wants to warn me. That is essentially the full list. When I saw the number, I didn't recognize it at first. New York area code. I almost didn't answer. Evelyn? One word. That was all. But I knew the voice immediately, even after 20 years, the way you always know the voice of someone who once had the power to hurt you. Marcus, I said. There was a pause. I could hear something behind him, movement, the sound of other people, the particular acoustic of a large and expensive room. Mother died, he said. He didn't say grandmother. He said mother. As if he needed me to understand immediately that he was not calling to reconnect, not calling to apologize, not calling to tell me that 20 years of silence had finally broken something in him and he needed his mother. He was calling to give me information. The way you call a neighbor to tell them a tree fell in the road. I sat down on my work stool. When? I asked. 3 weeks ago. The service already happened. Another pause. Deliberate. I wasn't sure you needed to be informed. I let that sit for a moment. Wasn't sure you needed to be informed. His grandmother, my mother-in-law, Dorothy Carter, had died 3 weeks ago, and my own son had spent 3 weeks deciding whether I deserved to know. Why are you calling now? I asked. The estate, he said. There's a will reading. The lawyers require your attendance. It's procedural. You'll be there, sign whatever needs to be signed, and then... He stopped. I could hear him choosing his words the way he always chose them, like ammunition. Then we can all go back to our lives. Marcus, I'll have my assistant email you the details. And then he was gone. I held the phone for a long time after he hung up. The workroom smelled like sawdust and linseed oil. The half-sanded chair arm sat in front of me, waiting. I should tell you about Dorothy because none of what happened later makes sense without her. Dorothy Hargrove Carter was one of the most complicated people I have ever known in my life, and I say that as a person who has known a great many complicated people. She came from old Southern money, not the plantation kind, but the department store kind, the 2 generations of careful investment kind. And she carried herself with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never once in her life wondered whether she deserved to be in the room. She did not approve of me when Richard brought me home. I was 26. I was from a middle-class family in Ohio. My father sold insurance. My mother taught elementary school. Dorothy was not rude about it. She was too well-bred for rudeness. But she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a smudge on an otherwise clean window. Richard and I married anyway. He was stubborn that way, and I loved that about him. We built something together, Richard and I. We built a business, a home, a son. For a long time, I believed it was enough. Then the winter of 1999 happened. I'm not going to tell you the whole story right now, partly because it's complicated and partly because I had spent 20 years not telling anyone, and old habits are hard to break all at once. What I will tell you is this. Richard's company was on the edge of collapse, not the slow kind of collapse that gives you time to adjust, the sudden kind. The kind that happens when someone has been making decisions behind closed doors that nobody else was supposed to know about, and then suddenly everyone knows. I made a choice. I stepped forward and took responsibility for something I had not done. I did it to protect the people I thought deserved protecting. I did it because I believed, and this is the part that still makes me feel like a fool 20 years later, that the truth would come out eventually, and that when it did, the people I had protected would stand up and say so. They didn't. Richard died in 2006 without ever correcting the record. And Marcus, my son, my only child, the boy I had spent 18 years raising with every ounce of love I had grown up believing a version of his mother that was not his mother at all. He believed I had betrayed the family. He believed I was selfish, reckless, and ultimately responsible for the losses they had suffered. He believed that Dorothy, his grandmother, was the one who had held everything together while I destroyed it. He believed the wrong story, and I had no one to blame but myself for staying silent long enough to let the wrong story become the truth he lived by. The flight to New York was uncomfortable in the way that flying economy is always uncomfortable when you are 78 and your back doesn't do well with sitting. I had an aisle seat, and the man next to me fell asleep before we'd even reached cruising altitude, which meant his elbow spent most of the flight on my armrest, and I was too tired to fight about it. I wore the navy dress. I don't know why I'm telling you this, except that it matters in the way that small details sometimes matter, Shem. The dress was something I had bought in 1998, good fabric, good cut, the kind of thing that doesn't go out of style because it never really tried to be stylish in the first place. It had hung in my closet through the move to Austin and 2 subsequent moves before that. I had not worn it in at least 15 years. When I put it on the morning of the flight, it was a little loose around the waist in a way it hadn't used to be, but it still fit, still worked. I thought, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in the early gray Austin morning, that I looked like what I was, an old woman who had been somewhere once and was going back. I took a car service from LaGuardia to a hotel in Midtown. Budget hotel, nothing fancy. I am not a person who spends money on hotels when a clean, decent room will do the same job. I ate dinner alone at a diner 2 blocks away, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that had been sitting in the pot for too long, and I sat in a corner booth and watched the city move past the window and tried to remember what it had felt like to belong to it. Manhattan has a particular quality at night that I always loved, even when I lived here. The light is different from anywhere else. Something about the density, the buildings, the people, the sheer weight of all that history stacked on top of itself, gives the air a particular kind of hum, almost electrical, that you don't find in smaller cities. Austin has its own energy. But this was different. This was the place where I had become the person I was, and also the place where that person had been dismantled, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. I went back to the hotel and did not sleep well. The law offices of Hargrove, Klein and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a building on Park Avenue that had the particular kind of architectural confidence that only comes with money. So old, it no longer needs to announce itself. Glass and steel with just enough marble in the lobby to remind you where you were. A receptionist at a desk that probably cost more than my car. Fresh flowers in a vase that were so perfectly arranged they looked almost fake. I arrived at 9:50 for a 10 o'clock appointment. I gave my name and the receptionist directed me to a waiting area. Cream-colored sofas, a low-glass table, a view of the city that made the buildings look like toys. I was the first person there. I sat and I waited, and I told myself that I was not afraid. That was not entirely true. Marcus arrived at 7 minutes past 10. He had always been the kind of man who arrived slightly late because he had decided, somewhere in his 40s, that it was a power move. He walked in with his girlfriend, a woman I had never met, blonde, maybe 35, wearing something that probably cost as much as my monthly pension, and a man in a charcoal suit who carried himself with the tight, watchful energy of someone whose job is to manage other people's money and who takes that job extremely seriously. Marcus stopped when he saw me. Just for a half second, just long enough for something to move across his face that I couldn't quite read. Then he put the smile on. "Evelyn," he said. "Not Mom, not Mother. Evelyn." "Marcus," I said. He didn't come over to me. He stood there in the center of the room with his hand resting on the small of his girlfriend's back, and he looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you don't recognize and aren't sure belongs in the room. "You look—" He paused just long enough for the pause to do its damage. "You made it okay. Good flight?" "Fine," I said. "Good." He turned to the receptionist. "Is Hargrove ready for us?" They settled onto the other sofa. Marcus and the girlfriend and the man in the charcoal suit, and the conversation that followed did not include me. Marcus talked in a low voice about something involving a property in the Hamptons, and the girlfriend laughed at something the money manager said, and I sat across from them and looked out the window at the city 32 floors below, and kept my hands quiet in my lap. I heard Marcus say something, half under his breath, that I was not supposed to hear. He was speaking to the money manager. Garrett, I heard him call him, and he said, "She came all the way from Texas. I almost feel bad." And then he laughed, and the girlfriend laughed, and even Garrett permitted himself a small, careful smile. Almost feel bad. I looked at my hands. The knuckles were swollen. They always were in the morning. Arthritis. Nothing to be done about it. My nails were clean and trimmed. I was wearing the only piece of jewelry I still owned from my married life. A simple gold band that had been Dorothy's mother's, which Dorothy herself had given me in 1985, in a moment of unexpected warmth that I had treasured for years, and that I now understood was more complicated than I had ever realized. I thought about getting up. I thought about walking out of that room and flying back to Austin and going back to my workroom in my half-sanded chair and never thinking about any of these people again. I didn't. Because here is something I learned in all those years of being silent and forgotten and written off. The moment you walk away is the moment you give them the ending they wrote for you. I was not going to give Marcus that. So I sat. And I waited, and I kept my face as still as water. At 10:20, the receptionist led all of us into a conference room where a man I understood to be Hargrove, late 60s, silver-haired, wearing the expression of someone who has sat through too many of these to be moved by any of them, stood up from behind a long mahogany table and shook our hands. He shook Marcus's hand first, then Garrett's, then the girlfriend's, with a practiced smile that said he'd learned long ago not to ask about plus ones, then mine. When he took my hand, he held it a fraction of a second longer than the others. His eyes moved to my face, and something in them shifted. Not pity, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. Like he had seen this situation before. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'm glad you could make the trip." "Thank you," I said. I wasn't sure I was going to. Something moved in Marcus's jaw, just a muscle, just a flicker. We sat down, and Hargrove opened a leather folder, and the reading of Dorothy Carter's last will and testament began. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the comfortable confidence of a man who has already counted the money. His hand was on the table, fingers loose. His girlfriend had her phone out below the edge of the table, trying to be subtle about it, not succeeding. Garrett had a legal pad and a pen, and was already holding the pen like he was ready to write things down. And me. I sat with my hands folded and my back straight, the way Dorothy herself had taught me to sit at a table in someone else's house, and I listened. The early provisions were what you'd expect. Household staff who had served Dorothy for years received meaningful gifts. Charities she'd supported received endowments. There was a provision for the maintenance of a property in Virginia that had been in the Hargrove family for 4 generations. Hargrove read through all of it in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who understood that these details mattered to someone, even if not to the man currently tapping his foot under the conference table. Then the reading slowed. Hargrove turned a page and his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. He glanced at me, then back at the document. "The following provision," he said, "is somewhat unusual, and I want to ensure all parties understand its implications before I proceed." Marcus straightened in his chair. "Mrs. Carter," Hargrove said, "before I continue, I need to ask you a question. Are you in possession of a key, a small brass key with the initials DHC engraved on the head?" The room went completely still. Marcus's foot had stopped tapping. I reached into my purse, the old leather purse I'd carried for 11 years because it was well made and did its job, and I saw no reason to replace it. And I found the small envelope that had arrived at my Austin address 3 months ago. Inside the envelope, which bore no return address and no explanation, was a small brass key with the initials DHC engraved on its head. I had carried it with me for 3 months without knowing what it opened. I set it on the table. The silence in that room had weight. Marcus stared at the key. His expression had changed into something I had not seen on his face in 20 years. Something raw and unguarded and a little afraid. "Good," Hargrove said quietly. "Then we can continue." And that is when I understood for the first time that Dorothy had been planning this for a very, very long time. That the story was not over. That it had in fact been waiting all these years for exactly this moment. The woman everyone had forgotten was sitting at the head of the table, and nobody in that room had realized it yet. Hargrove set the key aside with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that what he was about to say would change the temperature of the room permanently, and he was giving everyone one last moment of not knowing. I appreciated that, in retrospect. I didn't know it then. Then I was just sitting very still with my hands in my lap and my heart doing something complicated in my chest, watching Marcus stare at that small brass key the way a man stares at something he can't quite explain and doesn't like the feeling of. "Before I read the relevant provision," Hargrove said, folding his hands on top of the leather folder, "I want to establish the context that Mrs. Carter, Dorothy Carter, included in a separate letter attached to the document. She was very specific about wanting this context provided before the provision itself was read. She felt it was important that all parties understand the background." Marcus shifted in his chair. "That's not standard procedure." "No," Hargrove agreed, "it isn't. But it was Mrs. Carter's explicit instruction, and she had every legal right to structure the reading of her will as she wished. I intend to honor that." He paused. "If that's acceptable to you." The last sentence was not actually a question. The way Hargrove said it made that perfectly clear. Marcus pressed his mouth into a line and said nothing. Hargrove opened a separate envelope, cream-colored, thick paper, the kind Dorothy had always used for correspondence, and unfolded a single handwritten page. His reading glasses came out of his breast pocket. He settled them onto his nose, glanced at the page briefly, and then looked up at all of us. "Mrs. Carter's letter," he said, and then he began to read. "I'm not going to tell you everything Dorothy wrote. Some of it was personal. Some of it was the kind of thing that belongs to the people it was written for, and I don't believe in putting other people's private grief on display, even people who caused me tremendous pain. But I will tell you the part that mattered, the part that made the room go quiet in a way I had not experienced since the winter of 1999, when a different kind of silence had fallen over a different room and swallowed my life whole. Dorothy wrote, "I have been a coward for 23 years. I have told myself that my cowardice was protection, and that the story I allowed to stand was necessary for the family's survival. I no longer believe that. I am writing this because I am 81 years old and I have run out of time to keep believing comfortable lies, and because the person who deserved the truth most has been living without it for longer than anyone should have to." Hargrove's voice was steady, professional. He had probably read things in this room that would have broken a less disciplined man, and he gave Dorothy's words the same measured respect he gave everything else. But the words themselves were not steady. The words were an old woman bleeding onto paper. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me. Across from me, I heard Marcus exhale slowly through his nose. "The decisions made in the winter of 1999, Dorothy's letter continued, were not made by Evelyn. They were made by Richard, with my knowledge and, to my lasting shame, my tacit approval. When the consequences of those decisions became clear, it was Evelyn who stepped forward. It was Evelyn who agreed to carry what was not hers to carry, because she believed, and she was right to believe, that the alternative would destroy the company, the family, and the future her son was going to inherit. She was not reckless. She was not selfish. She was a woman who loved her family more than she loved her own reputation, and we repaid her by allowing her to disappear. The girlfriend, I still didn't know her name, hadn't been introduced, had put her phone completely away. She was sitting very still. Garrett, the money manager, was not writing anything on his legal pad. He was looking at a fixed point on the table approximately 6 inches in front of him. Marcus was looking at me. I did not look back. Not yet. I was not ready for that. Hargrove finished reading the letter. He folded it with the same careful deliberateness with which he'd unfolded it, set it aside, and removed his reading glasses. "I will now read the relevant provision," he said. What happened in the next 40 minutes was something I am still, even now, trying to process completely. Not because it was complicated. The legal language was dense, but Hargrove walked through it with the patience of a man who understood that clarity was his actual job, but because of what it meant. Because of what it said about 23 years of my life, reduced to a series of clauses in a document that an old woman had spent, Hargrove told us later, nearly 2 years preparing. Dorothy had left Marcus the house in Virginia. She had left him her personal belongings, the family photographs, the furniture, the silver. She had left him enough money to be comfortable for the rest of his life if he managed it carefully, which, knowing Marcus, he would not, but that was no longer any concern of mine. She had left me everything else. The company, what remained of it, restructured and considerably leaner than it had been in its peak years, but still operational, still valuable, worth a number that Hargrove stated in a level voice and that I will not repeat here because it is not the point, was transferred to me. The investment portfolio, the property in the Hamptons that Marcus had been talking about in the waiting room, a storage facility in New Jersey that Hargrove said contained documents and personal effects, which was what the brass key was for. And a letter. A separate letter, sealed, addressed to me in Dorothy's handwriting, which Hargrove slid across the table with both hands. I put it in my purse without opening it. I would read it alone. Whatever Dorothy had to say to me personally was not for this room. The silence after Hargrove finished reading had a completely different quality from the silence before. Before, it had been the silence of people waiting for something to happen. Now it was the silence of something having already happened, and nobody being quite sure what to do with the aftermath. Marcus broke it. "That's not—" He stopped. started again. There must be a challenge mechanism. There are grounds, Mr. Carter. Hargrove's voice was not unkind, but it was firm in the way that a stone wall is firm. Your grandmother spent 22 months working with this office to ensure that this document was unimpeachable. I can tell you, as the attorney who oversaw that process, that she anticipated every potential challenge and addressed each one with considerable care. You are absolutely within your rights to consult your own legal counsel, but I would strongly suggest doing so before making any decisions in this room today. Marcus's jaw was working. I could see it from across the table, the muscle jumping, the teeth tight together, the particular look of a man who has always believed he was standing on solid ground and has just felt it shift. She was 81, he said. Her mental capacity was evaluated by 2 independent physicians and a neuropsychological assessor at Mrs. Carter's own request, Hargrove said, 8 months before her death. The assessments are attached to the document and have been filed with the court. He paused. She thought of everything, Mr. Carter. That was the kind of woman she was. I heard something in those last words, something that might have been respect or admiration, or possibly just the careful neutrality of a man who had known Dorothy and understood what it had cost her to do what she'd done. Marcus pushed back from the table. He stood up. I need a moment, he said to no one in particular, and walked out of the conference room. The girlfriend looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at his legal pad. Neither of them said anything. I sat there in that cream-colored room 32 floors above Park Avenue, and I breathed. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant. That would make a better story. The wronged woman finally vindicated, sitting tall in her chair, while her arrogant son retreats, and the truth of 23 years comes flooding back into the light. I want to tell you, I felt that. What I actually felt was something closer to grief. Because here is what nobody tells you about being right after being wrong for 23 years. The rightness doesn't undo the wrongness. The years don't come back. The dinners that didn't happen, and the phone calls that were never made, and the Christmases spent alone in a farmhouse outside Austin with a glass of iced tea and the particular quiet of a life that is contracted around you. Those are just gone. No piece of paper gives them back. I thought about Richard. I thought about the man I had married, the man I had believed in, the man I had made a decision for in 1999 that I had never stopped paying for. I thought about whether he had known, in his last years, what I had given up, whether he had carried it with him the way I had, whether it had cost him anything at all. I decided I would probably never know the answer to that, and that it was better that way. Garrett cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, he said, and there was something strange about hearing that name directed at me again, in that room, in that city. I want to be transparent with you. Marcus retained me to provide financial advice in relation to what he expected to receive from this estate. Obviously, the circumstances have changed. He paused. If you find yourself in need of— Thank you, I said. I'll let you know. He nodded. He understood. He had the good sense not to push it. The girlfriend said quietly, I'm sorry about all of this. I didn't know. I looked at her for the first time properly. She was younger than I'd initially thought, closer to 30 than 35, and underneath the expensive clothes and the careful makeup was the face of someone who was genuinely uncomfortable, which suggested she was either a better person than Marcus deserved or just more perceptive about which way the wind was now blowing. I have learned at 78 that you can rarely tell those two things apart from the outside. It's all right, I said. None of it is your fault. Hargrove's assistant brought coffee. I took a cup, more for something to do with my hands than out of any real desire for it. The coffee was very good. Of course it was in a place like this, and I held it and looked out at the city and waited. Marcus came back 11 minutes later. I know it was 11 minutes because I had looked at my watch when he left. I don't know why. Force of habit, maybe. The habit of a woman who had spent decades managing time because time was the thing she was always running out of. He looked different when he came back. Not smaller, exactly. Marcus was not the kind of man who got smaller. It wasn't in his construction. But something had gone out of him. Some of the assurance had left his face, the way air leaves a room when you open a window too fast. He sat back down. He didn't look at me immediately. "I want to speak to Evelyn," he said. "Privately." Hargrove looked at me. The question was implicit. "All right," I said. Garrett and the girlfriend took their coffee and moved to the waiting area. Hargrove closed the conference room door behind them with a quiet click that felt, in the moment, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Marcus and I were alone in a room together for the first time in 23 years. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at me. His face had settled into something I wasn't sure how to read. It wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite shame, wasn't quite the particular blankness of a man who has decided to feel nothing because feeling something costs too much. It was somewhere between all of those, and it was the most human I had seen him look since he had walked into that office that morning. "You knew," he said. "You knew about the letter, about what she was going to do." "No," I said. "I didn't." "The key arrived 3 months ago, with no explanation." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't call," he said. "You didn't call me. You didn't call the lawyers. You didn't try to find out." "Why would I have called you, Marcus?" I asked. The words came out more quietly than I expected. Not sharp, just honest. "When was the last time you answered?" He didn't have an answer for that. He looked back at his hands. The thing about sitting across from your own child after 23 years is that you can't stop seeing both versions of them at once. I kept seeing Marcus at 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in our house in Westchester, working on a model car that Richard had bought him, his tongue between his teeth the way he always held it when he was concentrating. I kept seeing him at 14, coming home after his first real swim meet, dripping on the front porch and trying not to show how proud he was of himself because he was 14 and pride was embarrassing. And then I kept seeing him at 29, standing in the doorway of this very city's courthouse after the proceedings that had formalized my professional ruin, looking at me with a coldness I had not known his face was capable of, and saying, in a voice so flat it didn't even have the heat of anger in it, "I don't think I can look at you right now." He had not looked at me since, 23 years. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I am not here for revenge. I was not sitting in this room all morning waiting to watch you fall. That is not who I am." "Then what do you want?" he asked. And in his voice, underneath the defensiveness, there was something that sounded almost like the question he was actually asking, which was, "Who are you?" "I want the truth to be known," I said. "That's all. That's what I've wanted for 23 years and never been able to have. The truth. Not your grandmother's version of it, not your father's version of it. What actually happened." "And the money?" His voice sharpened, just slightly. Old reflex. "The money," I said, "is not what I came here for." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and completely wasn't. "Evelyn, come on." "Marcus." I leaned forward slightly, not aggressively. I was too old and too tired for aggression, but enough to make him look at me. "I'm 78 years old. I restore furniture in a farmhouse outside Austin, Texas. I have a neighbor who waves at me from his truck and another neighbor I've never spoken to. I have your Aunt Patricia, who calls me every Sunday. That is my life. I'm not sitting here calculating how to maximize my inheritance. I'm sitting here because your grandmother finally told the truth, and I needed to be in the room when it happened." Something moved in his face. "She should have told me years ago," he said. "Yes," I said. "She should have. She let me believe—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "She let you believe something that wasn't true," I said. "And so did your father. And so, for that matter, did I. I won't pretend I had no part in it. I made choices. Some of them were wrong, but none of them were the ones you were told they were." Marcus sat back. He put one hand over his face, rubbing his forehead, and for a second he looked not like the wealthy, arrogant man who had walked into this office that morning, but like a 52-year-old man who had just discovered that the story he had organized his entire understanding of himself around was built on somebody else's lie, which was, in fact, exactly what had happened. I let the silence sit. I wasn't going to fill it for him. After a long moment, he said, "What actually happened in 1999?" And I told him. I want to be honest with you. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head for 23 years. In the farmhouse, in the workroom, on the back porch watching the Austin sun go down. I had rehearsed it hundreds of times, imagined every version of it, every possible response, every way it could go right or terribly wrong. I had imagined telling Marcus the truth in anger, and in tears, and in cold, precise language that left no room for misunderstanding, and in the broken, stumbling way that real conversations actually happen. None of my rehearsals were quite right. What actually happened was I talked, and Marcus listened, and neither of us cried, and neither of us raised our voices, and the conversation was not clean or cathartic or the kind of thing that resolves itself neatly. It was two people sitting in a conference room trying to locate each other across 23 years of distance and finding that the distance had not entirely closed even now, even with the truth finally on the table between us. I told him about the winter of 1999, about Richard's decisions, specific decisions, names, numbers, the particular sequence of events that had led to the crisis. About the conversation Richard and I had had in the kitchen of our Westchester house at 2 a.m, when he had told me how bad it really was, when I had understood for the first time that the man I had married had been doing things behind doors I didn't know existed. I told Marcus about Dorothy's role, how she had known, not everything, but enough, how she had made a choice as the family's matriarch about what story would hold things together, and how I had agreed to that story because I believed, and I want to be clear that I believed this, I was not forced, I made a choice, that the alternative was worse. I told him that I had been wrong about that, not wrong to want to protect the company, not wrong to want to protect Marcus's future, wrong to believe that a lie built on sacrifice holds together better than the truth, wrong to believe that being erased was a price worth paying. Marcus listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you fight?" he finally asked. "After, when it was over, why didn't you say something? Come back? Make them admit it?" "Because by the time I considered it," I said, "you had already decided who I was. And I was so tired, Marcus. I was so tired." I paused. And I stopped, looked at the table. "I think part of me believed you. That if Richard and Dorothy and everyone else thought I was the one who had failed, maybe I was. Maybe I had. You tell someone something about themselves long enough and they start to hear it in their own voice. That landed somewhere in him. I could see it. That's not," he shook his head, "that's not how it was supposed to be." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." He was quiet again. Outside the conference room windows, the city moved in its enormous, indifferent way. Taxis and pedestrians, and the light changing, and someone on the sidewalk 32 floors below, who was probably having the most ordinary Tuesday of their life, completely unaware that up here, in this room, 23 years of a family's worth of damage was sitting out in the open for the first time. "I don't know how to," Marcus started. "You don't have to know right now," I said. "I treated you." "You did," I said. "Yes." He looked at me, and I looked back, and for the first time in 23 years we were actually in the same room. "I'm not asking you to fix everything today," I said. "I'm 78 years old, Marcus. I don't have the energy for big dramatic reconciliations, and I wouldn't trust one if it happened. Those things don't work. They feel good for about 15 minutes, and then real life comes back and all the same patterns are still there." I folded my hands on the table. "What I'm asking is that you not leave here today and spend the next year telling yourself a new version of the old story. What I'm asking is that you sit with what you heard in this room and actually think about it." He nodded slowly, not enthusiastically, not with the energy of a man who has had a revelation and is ready to be transformed. Just, he nodded, carefully, like a man picking up something fragile. It was enough. We came back out of the conference room and Hargrove walked me through the remainder of the estate proceedings. The signatures required, the timeline for the transfer of assets, the address of the storage facility in New Jersey where the documents and personal effects were waiting. His assistant provided me with a thick envelope of materials to review with my own attorney, which I would need to retain, which was a thing I had not had in over a decade. Garrett had gone by the time we came out. The girlfriend, whose name, I learned eventually, was Simone, was sitting on the cream-colored sofa, scrolling her phone, and when Marcus and I emerged from the conference room, she looked up and assessed the situation with the particular quickness of someone who is very good at reading rooms. She looked at Marcus's face. She looked at mine. She put her phone away. She touched Marcus's arm and said nothing. Surprisingly decent of her. Marcus and I stood in the waiting area near the elevator and had the brief, stilted exchange that people have when they have said something enormous and don't know how to manage the ordinary space after it. He said he would be in touch. I said I hope so. He said he needed time. I said I understood. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. And then Marcus said just before the doors closed, quietly, not dramatically, not like a movie moment, he said, "I should have called." The doors closed. I rode down 32 floors looking at my own reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors. An old woman in a navy dress with swollen knuckles and silver hair, holding a purse against her ribs and a brass key she now understood the purpose of, and a sealed letter from a dead woman who had spent 23 years being afraid. I looked tired. I looked older than I remembered being. I looked like someone who had just done a very hard thing and wasn't entirely sure yet what came next. The lobby was cool and marble smooth and smelled of fresh flowers. The receptionist at the front desk smiled at me as I passed. Outside, Park Avenue was exactly what it always was. Loud, bright, relentless, alive with the particular energy of people who have somewhere to be and are already late. I stood on the sidewalk and let the city wash over me for a moment. The letter was in my purse. The key was in my purse. Somewhere in New Jersey was a storage unit full of documents that I had not yet read, evidence that had been waiting for me for 23 years. I thought about calling Patricia. She would want to know. She had been asking me for years to fight back, to say something, to stop accepting the silence, and I had always told her it wasn't that simple, and she had always said she knew it wasn't simple, but I needed to do it anyway. I didn't call her yet. That conversation deserved more than a sidewalk. Instead, I hailed a cab. An actual yellow cab, the old kind, which made me feel briefly like the person I had been when I lived here, and gave the driver the name of the diner where I'd eaten dinner the night before. I wasn't hungry. I just needed somewhere to sit that wasn't a hotel room, somewhere with people moving around me and the smell of coffee and the background noise of ordinary life, while I opened the letter. The cab driver had the radio on. Some talk show, voices overlapping, someone laughing at something. I watched the city go past the windows and thought about the brass key in my purse and what was waiting at the other end of it, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more like the moment just before a door opens. That particular quality of standing on a threshold, knowing that what is on the other side of it will change the shape of things, and not yet knowing how. The diner had the same laminated menus and the same slightly too long coffee and the same corner booth, which was empty, which I took as the small mercy it was. I ordered coffee I didn't need. I set Dorothy's sealed letter on the table in front of me. I looked at my name in her handwriting, Evelyn, in the blue ink she had always used, in the careful cursive of a woman who had been taught that penmanship was a form of respect. I put my hand on the envelope, and then I opened it, and I began to read. Dorothy's handwriting was exactly as I remembered it, precise, controlled. Each letter formed with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been taught that how you wrote said something about who you were, and who had believed that her entire life. I had always found her handwriting slightly intimidating, the way I had found many things about Dorothy slightly intimidating before I learned that intimidating people are often the most frightened ones in the room. The letter was 4 pages long. I read it in the corner booth of that diner on Lexington Avenue, with the coffee going cold beside me and the lunch crowd beginning to filter in around me. And I did not look up once. I'm going to tell you what was in it. Not word for word. I told you already. Some of it was private, some of it belongs to the dead, and I won't excavate that. But the substance of it. The thing Dorothy had spent, apparently, the last 2 years of her life trying to find the courage to say. She began by telling me she was sorry. Not in the way people say sorry when they mean I regret that you were hurt, the passive, bloodless kind of apology, that protects the person giving it more than it helps the person receiving it. She said it the other way, the harder way. She wrote, "I am sorry for what I did, not for what happened to you as though you were a bystander to a car accident, for what I did. There is a difference, and I'm old enough now to insist on it. That alone would have been enough. After 23 years, that alone would have been a great deal." But Dorothy had more to say. She told me things I had not known, things that filled in the spaces of the story I had been carrying, that explained shapes I had always felt but never been able to see clearly. She told me that in the months after 1999, Richard had come to her twice wanting to correct the record, wanting to stand up and say what had actually happened. She had talked him out of it, both times. She had given him reasons: the company's stability, Marcus's college plans, the reputational damage a public correction would cause. And Richard, who had always been better at building things than at the moral accounting that came afterward, had let himself be persuaded. She wrote, "I told myself I was protecting the family. I was protecting myself. I did not want to admit what Richard had done, because admitting what Richard had done meant admitting what I had allowed to go on under my own roof, in my own family, for years before 1999. It was easier to let you carry it. That is an ugly sentence to write. It is true. I sat with that for a long time. Here is something I have learned about truth that comes too late. It does not feel the way you expect it to. You imagine when you have been waiting for something a long time that getting it will feel like relief, like putting down a heavy bag after a long walk. And there is some of that. But there is also something else, something that has no clean name, which is the feeling of understanding, fully and finally, that the years were real. That the 23 mornings you woke up carrying something that wasn't yours to carry, those mornings did not unhappen just because the truth is finally on the table. The truth arrives and the years stay exactly where they were. Dorothy's letter went on. She told me about the storage unit. She told me that beginning in 2003, 4 years after 1999, 3 years before Richard died, she had begun quietly assembling documents, financial records, internal communications, correspondence between Richard and the parties involved in the decisions that had caused the crisis. She had done it carefully, over years, without telling anyone. She had hired a private archivist, a woman named Claudette, who she described briefly as the most discreet person she had ever employed, to organize and preserve everything. The storage unit in New Jersey contained Claudette's work. 17 banker's boxes, a complete record of what had actually happened, documented and indexed and preserved. Why she had assembled it, she wrote, was something she had asked herself many times. She had told herself it was for legal protection. She had told herself it was for history. The real reason, she admitted, was simpler and harder. I think I always knew that someday the truth would need somewhere to land. I think I was building it a place. The last page of the letter was the shortest, 4 paragraphs. I read it twice. She wrote that she had debated, in the final months of her life, whether to contact me directly, whether to call or write or ask one of the lawyers to arrange a meeting. She had decided against it. She wrote, "I was afraid you would refuse to see me. I was afraid you would be right to. And I was afraid that if I saw you face to face, I would find a way to make it about my own guilt rather than your truth, because that is what I have always done. And I'm not certain I was capable of being different. So I did it this way instead, clumsy, cowardly, perhaps still. But the best I could manage." The last paragraph said, "The key is for everything I built for you. The documents, the records, the proof. Do with it what you need to do. You owe me nothing. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even the courtesy of reading this letter all the way through. But if you do read it, I want you to know one thing. I saw you. Even when I let others pretend you weren't there, I always saw you, and I'm sorry it took me until now to say so. I folded the letter, I put it back in the envelope. I sat in that corner booth for a long time, watching the lunch crowd move around me, and I thought about Dorothy at 81, in whatever room she had been in when she wrote that, with whatever was left of her strength, choosing finally to say the things she had spent 23 years not saying. I thought, you should have done it sooner, and I thought, at least you did it. Both of those things were true. I have learned at 78 that two contradictory things can both be true, and that the discomfort of holding them both is not a problem to be solved. It is just the texture of an honest life. I paid for the coffee. I left a tip that was probably too large for what I'd ordered. I walked back out into the afternoon light of Lexington Avenue, and I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, because Patricia had never once in her 69 years let a phone ring more than twice if she was near it. "Ev," she said, "how did it go?" I stood on the sidewalk with my hand pressed against the outside of my purse, feeling the shape of the letter through the leather, and I said, "She told the truth." The silence on Patricia's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Dorothy, in the will, and in a letter." I paused. "She told everything." Another silence. Longer this time. And then Patricia, who was not a woman given to dramatic displays of emotion, said, "Oh, thank the stars," in a voice that was so quiet and so raw that it made my throat close. "I know," I said. "And Marcus?" "He heard it, in the room. How was he?" I thought about Marcus's face when he'd come back into the conference room, the way something had gone out of him, the way he'd said, just before the elevator doors closed, "I should have called." "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "He's processing it. Whether that turns into anything real, I don't know. I'm not counting on anything." "You shouldn't," Patricia said with the firmness of a woman who had watched me get hurt enough times to have opinions about it. "I know. What are you going to do?" I looked up the street. The city was doing what it always did, moving and loud and completely indifferent to the private catastrophes taking place within it. Somewhere uptown, Marcus was probably sitting in the back of an Uber with Simone, in some version of silence I could not quite picture. Somewhere in New Jersey, 17 boxes of documents were sitting in a climate-controlled storage unit with a brass key lock, waiting. "Tomorrow," I said, "I'm going to New Jersey." The storage facility was called Meridian Safe Storage, which was the kind of name that suggested it had been named by someone who wanted it to sound more distinguished than a building full of other people's accumulated things had any right to sound. It was in a town about 40 minutes outside the city, reachable by a combination of train and cab that took me an hour and 15 minutes door to door and reminded me how much I had not missed commuting. The facility manager was a young man, couldn't have been more than 25, with a name tag that said Troy and the particular energy of someone who takes the security of other people's storage units extremely seriously. He checked my identification, cross-referenced it against the estate documentation Hargrove's office had emailed the previous afternoon, examined the brass key, and then walked me personally to Unit 114 with the solemnity of someone escorting a dignitary. The unit was not large. 10 by 15, climate-controlled, lit by a single overhead fluorescent that hummed quietly. Along the right wall, stacked neatly on industrial shelving, were 17 bankers' boxes, each one labeled in the same precise handwriting I recognized from Dorothy's letter. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Troy said, "I can get you a table and a chair if you need them." "Yes," I said. "Please." He brought a folding table and a metal chair and set them up in the center of the unit with a degree of care that I found genuinely touching, and then he said he'd be at the front desk if I needed anything and left me alone. I sat down. I looked at the boxes. I want to tell you that I felt powerful in that moment, that I felt like the protagonist of the story my life had turned into overnight. I did not. I felt tired and slightly cold despite the climate control, and I had a dull ache in my lower back from the train, and I was wearing the same navy dress from the day before because I had not thought to bring more than one good dress to what I'd assumed would be a single day's proceedings. I pulled the first box off the shelf, opened it, and began to read. It took me most of that day and all of the next to get through everything. Claudette, whoever she was, whatever Dorothy had paid her, had done extraordinary work. The boxes were organized chronologically and by subject, each document in a labeled folder, each folder indexed on a master sheet inside the box lid. It was the kind of organization that spoke to years of careful, patient work, and to a very clear understanding of what the documents were for and what they would someday need to prove. I'm not going to give you a detailed account of everything I found. The specifics involve financial instruments and corporate decisions and legal mechanisms that would take longer to explain than the story itself, and they belong, in any case, to the lawyers who will eventually do the explaining professionally. What I'm going to tell you is the shape of what was there, what it meant. Richard had been making decisions, beginning in the mid-1990s, that had exposed the company to levels of risk that the board of directors did not know about and had not approved. He had done it with the assistance of two men. I recognized one name, did not know the other, who had been, essentially, taking money out of one pocket and putting it in another in ways designed to obscure what was actually happening. It was not illegal in the simplest sense of the word, but it was deeply wrong, and when the exposure finally came in 1999, it had come suddenly and completely, and with the kind of damage that required an explanation. The explanation they had chosen was me. I had been the company's creative director. I had been involved in a property development project in the late 1990s that had lost money. Genuinely lost money. That was real. I had made decisions on that project that I still think about. And that had been the thread they pulled. They had taken my real failure, my actual mistake, and wrapped around it a narrative that made it responsible for things it had never touched. They had built a story in which I was not merely the person whose project hadn't worked, but the person whose recklessness had endangered everything. And they had told that story to Marcus and to Dorothy's extended family and to the people in the industry who mattered. And they had told it with enough detail and consistency that it had become, for everyone who knew us, the truth. Claudette's boxes contained the original documents that proved the actual sequence of events, the internal communications showing what Richard knew and when, the financial records showing where the real losses had originated, the paper trail that had been quietly buried while my name was put over the grave. By the evening of the second day, I had read enough to understand the full shape of it. I sat in that folding chair in Unit 114, with a stack of folders on the table in front of me, and I felt something move through me that I don't have a precise word for. It wasn't anger, though anger was there. It wasn't grief, though grief was there too. It was more like recognition. The feeling of finally seeing something you have always known the shape of, but could never quite make out in the dark. I called Hargrove from the parking lot. "I've been through the materials," I said. "And?" He had the professional neutrality of a man who was asking because he needed to, not because he was surprised. "They're what she said they were," I said. "They're complete. I'm going to need a recommendation for litigation counsel." A brief pause. "I anticipated that," he said. "I can give you 3 names. All of them know the case history. I briefed them at Mrs. Carter's request, conditionally, before her death. She wanted the option available to you immediately." I thought about that. Dorothy, in the last year of her life, briefing attorneys for a case I hadn't known I would have yet. Planning things I hadn't known would need planning. Being, even at the end, the most strategically prepared person in any room she was in. "She really did think of everything," I said. "She really did," Hargrove agreed. And in his voice was the thing I had heard there the day before, that complicated respect for a complicated woman. I flew back to Austin the following morning with a carry-on bag and a briefcase I had bought at a luggage store near the hotel, containing a selection of the documents Hargrove's office had agreed to temporarily image and return to the storage unit. My lower back had gone from dull ache to genuine complaint by the time I got to the gate, and I sat in an airport chair and stretched it carefully and thought about the fact that I was 78 years old and had just spent 2 days going through 23 years' worth of documents in a New Jersey storage unit, and that this was not how I had expected this week to go. On the plane, I did not read. I looked out the window at the clouds and thought about Richard. I had not let myself think about him properly in the conference room, or in the diner, or in the storage unit. There was too much else to manage, too many things that needed my immediate attention, and grief, real grief, the kind you have for someone you loved even after they let you down, has a way of waiting. It's patient. It knows you'll get to it eventually. Richard and I had been good together once. I want to say that clearly because I think it's important, not to excuse what he did, not to soften it, but because erasing the good parts would be its own kind of dishonesty. We had been good. We had built something real. The problem was not that we were wrong for each other. The problem was that Richard, when faced with a choice between his own discomfort and someone else's, had consistently chosen the path that cost him the least. not cruelly, not maliciously, just consistently, across years, across decisions large and small, until the cumulative weight of all those small choices had built something enormous. And when it finally fell, it had fallen on me. I thought about the fact that he had gone to Dorothy twice, wanting to correct it, that something in him had known, that he had let her talk him out of it and then gone on living with it, and I would never know what those years had been like for him because he had taken whatever accounting he'd done with himself to wherever it is that people go. I thought, I don't forgive you yet, and I thought, I don't know if I ever will, and I thought, I'm not sure it matters now. The truth is out. That's what matters. The plane landed. I took a cab home. The farmhouse looked smaller after New York, the way it always did when I came back from anywhere. The lane had a new pothole that hadn't been there when I left, just past the cedar tree, and the front porch light needed the bulb changed, which it had needed for 3 weeks, and which I had been meaning to get to. The workroom was exactly as I'd left it, the walnut side chair still sitting in the middle of the floor, half sanded, waiting. I set my bags down in the front hallway. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about what came next. What came next was complicated. Litigation, probably. The attorneys Hargrove had recommended would need to review the documents and advise on what was viable, what the statute of limitations allowed, what the realistic outcomes were. The company's management would need to be notified of the ownership transfer. There were financial accounts to be organized and professional advisors to be retained, and approximately 100 practical decisions to be made that I had not made in 23 years because I had not had anything to make decisions about. And Marcus. There was Marcus. He called 4 days after I got home. I was in the workroom when the phone rang, my hands wrapped around the chair leg with fine grit sandpaper, the radio on low in the background playing something from the 1970s that I didn't recognize but that had a pleasant, unhurried quality to it. I answered. Evelyn? A pause. It's Marcus. I know, I said. Another pause. I could hear him organizing himself, finding words. Marcus had always been someone who needed to organize himself before he could say anything honest. He'd been that way as a child, the long silences before the important admissions, the taking of breath. I've been thinking, he said. All right. About what you said, and what Hargrove read. And I talked to Simone, and I talked to my therapist. He stopped. I have a therapist. I don't know if that surprises you. It doesn't, I said. Good. She said, another stop. She said that the way I responded to finding out the truth was consistent with someone who had organized their entire understanding of a family situation around information that turned out to be incorrect, and that the response to discovering that was going to involve a grieving process. And I thought that sounded like therapy speak, but the more I sat with it, the more I thought she was probably right. I held the phone and listened to my son trying haltingly to be honest with me for the first time in 23 years. She also said, he continued, that my first priority should be to understand the impact on you rather than to process my own feelings about how I was misled. Because you were the person who was actually harmed, and not me, and that any conversation I have with you where I make it about my feelings about being deceived is a conversation that's centering the wrong person. That was not what I had expected him to say. Your therapist sounds very good, I said. She is. A brief sound that was almost a laugh. Expensive, but good. The conversation moved slowly and imperfectly through things I won't reconstruct entirely, things that belong to the two of us and to no one else. But there were parts of it I want to tell you about because they are the parts that mattered. He said, I want to understand what the last 23 years have actually been like for you. Not so I can feel bad about it or to punish myself, but because I think I've been telling myself a version of your life that made it easier for me not to feel responsible for it. And I want to stop doing that. I said, that's going to be a hard conversation, Marcus. I know, he said. I'm not asking for it right now. I'm asking if it's a conversation we can eventually have. Yes, I said. Eventually, yes. He said, I don't expect you to. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I don't even think I'd know what that means, since most of the way things were was built on something that wasn't true. What I'd like, what I'm asking, he stopped again, longer this time. I'd like to be someone you can call. If something breaks in the house, or you need something, or I'd like to be available. It was such a small thing. I'd like to be available. Not a grand apology, not a declaration, not the kind of thing that looks right in a movie. Just, I would like to be a person who picks up the phone. 23 years, and what he was offering was, I'll pick up the phone. I should tell you that I felt the inadequacy of it. I did. That I felt the weight of everything it wasn't and couldn't be, the years it didn't address, and the damage it didn't undo. I am not going to pretend that one phone call in a therapist's framework resolved something that had been built up over more than 2 decades, but I'm also not going to pretend that it meant nothing. Okay, I said. That's a place to start. After we hung up, I sat in the workroom for a long time. The chair leg in my hand, the radio still playing, the afternoon light coming through the single window the way it did in late spring, low and golden, turning the dust in the air into something almost beautiful. I thought about the 17 boxes in New Jersey. I thought about the attorneys I hadn't yet called, the financial advisors I would need to find, the company whose ownership had transferred to my name and that I would need to make decisions about. I thought about all of it waiting for me, patient and enormous, on the other side of this quiet room. I thought about Dorothy writing that letter, building those boxes, spending 2 years preparing the Truth a landing place because she had understood, finally, too late, but finally, that truth without evidence is just a story, and that a story is not enough. She had given me the evidence. What I did with it was up to me. I picked up the chair leg again. I found the place where I'd left off with the sandpaper. The wood was warm under my hands, the grain of it smooth and consistent in the way that good old walnut always is, the kind of material that rewards patience. I worked until the light changed, and then I stopped. That night, I called the first attorney on Hargrove's list. His name was David Reyes, and he had a low, careful voice and asked precise questions and said, when I finished explaining the situation, that the documents sounded like they constituted a strong case for a specific type of legal remedy that he wanted to walk me through in detail. How soon can you come to New York? He asked. Next week, I said. Good. He paused. Mrs. Carter, based on what you've described, I think you should know that the people who constructed that narrative in 1999 may still be professionally active. One of them, at least, is a named partner in a fairly prominent firm. I had already known that. I had found the name in Claudette's files. Yes, I said. I'm aware. This will get complicated, Reyes said. Complicated and probably public at some point. I want to make sure you're prepared for that. I thought about the navy dress in my closet. I thought about the farmhouse and the walnut chair and the pothole in the lane and Dale waving from his truck and the life I had built around being forgotten, around being small, around asking for nothing, because asking for nothing meant no one could take anything more. I thought about being 78 years old and running out of time to keep believing that silence was the same as peace. Mr. Reyes, I said, I have been prepared for this for 23 years. He said he would have his assistant send calendar options in the morning. I hung up and sat in the kitchen with the lights off and the window above the sink showing me a patch of Texas night sky, very dark, very clear, the kind of sky you only get far enough outside a city that the light doesn't reach. Somewhere out there, the people who had built a lie on top of my life were going about their evenings. Having dinner, maybe. Watching something on television. Existing in the comfortable certainty of people who have made a decision long enough ago that it no longer feels like a decision, just like the way things are. That was about to change. Not because of revenge. I want to be clear about that. I have said it before, and I'm going to keep saying it because it is true. This was not revenge. Revenge is about making someone feel what you feel. What I was doing was something different. I was building a record. I was ensuring that the thing that had happened was named correctly, in a place where naming things correctly has consequences, so that the people who came after me, the people who would inherit the company, the young designers who might someday work for the firms those men ran, the world that would go on after I was gone, would know what had happened and who had been responsible for it. That is not revenge. That is just refusing to let the wrong story be the last one told. I went to bed at 10:30. My back still ached. I slept eventually in the particular way that very tired people sleep. Not peacefully, exactly, but completely. The kind of sleep that is less rest and more the body simply insisting on its own recovery regardless of what the mind wants to keep turning over. In the morning, I changed the light bulb on the front porch. Then I went back to the workroom and finished sanding the walnut chair. David Reyes worked out of a building on West 57th Street that was deliberately understated in the way that only very confident law firms allow themselves to be. No marble lobby, no fresh flowers engineered to impress, just good carpet, and the particular quiet of a place where serious work was done, and the people doing it knew it. His office was on the 14th floor. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, a desk that had actual paper on it in actual stacks, and a view of the street below that was less dramatic than Hargrove's Park Avenue panorama, but somehow more honest. He was shorter than I'd imagined from the phone. I always imagine voices as being taller than they turn out to be. And he wore his glasses on a cord around his neck, which reminded me of my father, who had done the same thing for the last 30 years of his life. He stood up when I came in, shook my hand, said, "Mrs. Carter, thank you for making the trip again," and meant it, which I could tell because he was looking at me when he said it, rather than at the door behind me. "Please," I said. "Evelyn?" "Evelyn." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee, water?" "Water would be good." His assistant brought a glass and then closed the door behind her, and then it was just the two of us and the stacks of paper and the sound of the city below. And David Reyes opened a folder and told me what 23 years of buried truth was worth in a court of law. I want to be careful about how I tell you this part, because it would be easy to make it sound cleaner than it was. It would be easy to say, the lawyer laid out the case, the evidence was overwhelming, and justice was served. That is the shape of the story, and eventually that shape proved accurate, but the reality of getting there was nothing like clean. What Reyes told me that morning was that we had, based on the documents from Claudette's boxes, a strong basis for two separate legal actions. The first involved the men who had structured the financial arrangements in the 1990s, specifically the misrepresentation of liability and the deliberate misdirection of responsibility in the aftermath. One of them, a man named Philip Garrett Weston, was indeed a named partner in a mid-sized firm that had continued to grow in the years since. The other, a man named Alan Frost, had retired in 2014 and was living in Connecticut. The statute of limitations, Reyes said carefully, is the central challenge. These events occurred over 2 decades ago, and most standard civil claims would be time-barred by now. He paused. However, he picked up a specific folder. Your situation involves what is sometimes called fraudulent concealment. When a defendant actively conceals their conduct and its consequences from the plaintiff, and when the plaintiff had no reasonable means of discovering the concealed information, the statute of limitations can be told, meaning it doesn't start running until the plaintiff discovers, or reasonably should have discovered, the concealed information. The documents in the storage unit, I said. The documents in the storage unit combined with the letter from Dorothy Carter acknowledging the concealment and her participation in it constitute a compelling argument that you had no meaningful access to the truth until the will reading. He looked at me over his glasses. Dorothy appears to have understood this. The way she structured the revelation, the formal will reading, the attached letter, the assembled documentation, creates a very specific evidentiary timeline. She was building you a legal foundation, not just a personal one. I sat with that for a moment. Dorothy, at 81, assembling not just a confession, but a case. Not just telling the truth, but creating the conditions under which the truth could be used. She was a strategic woman, I said. She was, Reyes agreed. It's a shame she didn't deploy that particular strategy 20 years earlier. Yes, I said. It is. We spent the next 3 hours going through the details. Reyes asked precise, careful questions, and I answered them. And occasionally he would write something on a legal pad with the particular speed of someone whose handwriting has long since stopped resembling actual letters and become purely functional notation. He had two colleagues who appeared at different points, a young woman named Priya, who specialized in financial fraud, and who looked at the Claudette documents with an expression that was professionally neutral but had a brightness underneath it that told me she found them significant, and an older man named Robert, who said almost nothing but read 3 pages of one specific folder and then said, "This is workable," in a tone that I gathered was the most enthusiastic thing he ever said about anything. At the end of it, Reyes sat back and said, "I want to be honest with you about what this looks like in terms of timeline and difficulty." "Please," I said. "This will take time, possibly a long time. Litigation of this complexity, involving events this old with parties who will have their own substantial legal resources. We are not talking about months. We may be talking about years." "I'm 78, I said. "I know." He said it without flinching, which I respected. "I want you to make this decision with complete information. There will be depositions, document production, potential motions to dismiss, appeals. There will be periods where nothing visible is happening and periods where it becomes very public and very intense. It will cost money. I will give you a realistic estimate of fees, and there are also contingency arrangements we can discuss. And it will require you to tell your story, repeatedly, in detail, to people whose job is to find the weakest version of it." I looked at him. "Is the case strong enough?" I asked. "In your honest assessment." He held my gaze for a moment. "The documents are exceptional. Claudette's organization alone is worth more than I can fully quantify right now. She essentially built us a chronological proof of concealment. Combined with Dorothy's letter and the formal estate proceedings, yes. In my honest assessment, the case is strong." "Then I want to proceed," I said. He nodded, not surprised. "There's one more thing I need to ask you about," he said. "Philip Weston." I nodded. "He's aware of the estate proceedings. The legal community is small, and Hargrove's firm and Weston's firm have overlapping circles. I can't say definitively that he knows about the documentation, but I think we have to assume he is at minimum aware that the will revealed certain information." Reyes paused. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that he tries to make contact before we file, directly or through intermediaries." "What would that look like?" I asked. "It could look like a lot of things. A friendly call from someone mutual, a letter from his attorney suggesting an informal conversation. In worst cases, pressure through Marcus, though given the current state of your relationship with your son, that avenue may be less available to him than it used to be." He looked at me. "The important thing is that you call me before you respond to anything from his direction, anything at all." "Understood," I said. Reyes was right. It took 11 days. The call came through Marcus, but not the way Reyes had worried it might, not as pressure, but as something more complicated. Marcus called me on a Thursday evening and said, in a voice that was carefully controlled in the way of someone trying to manage their own reaction to something, "I need to tell you something. I got a call today from a man named Weston." I sat down in the kitchen chair. "He introduced himself as a former business associate of your father's," Marcus continued. "He said he'd heard about grandmother's estate and that he wanted to reach out. He said," a pause. "He said he was concerned about some misunderstandings that might arise from old documents that were missing important context." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I wasn't the right person to call," Marcus said. "I told him that any questions about the estate should go to Hargrove's office, and that my relationship with you was a private matter." Another pause. "Then I hung up and called you." I breathed. "That was exactly right," I said. "Marcus, is he someone I should be worried about?" "He's someone my attorney is handling. You did exactly the right thing by calling me immediately. Don't speak to him again. If he calls back, don't answer. If he reaches out through anyone else, call me first." "Evelyn." His voice changed slightly. Something more careful came into it. "What is this actually about?" I understood the broad picture from what happened in the reading, but I don't think I understand what you're doing now. I decided to tell him, not everything, not the legal strategy, not the details that were Reyes's to manage, but the shape of it, the basic truth of what was happening and why. When I finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "They helped set you up." "Yes." "They helped construct the story that—" He stopped. "That I believed for 23 years." "Yes." Another long silence. "What do you need from me?" I had not expected that. Not yet. Not at this stage of the tentative, careful thing we were building between us. The thing that was not yet anything solid, and that I was not yet certain would become something solid, because I had learned not to count on things until they proved themselves. "Nothing right now," I said honestly. "What I need is for you to stay out of it. Don't engage with Weston. Don't engage with anyone who approaches you about it, and trust me to handle it." That's not nothing, asking me to trust you." "No," I said, "it isn't." There was something in that exchange that I have thought about many times since. The strange, uncomfortable work of rebuilding trust with someone who had reason to extend it in both directions. Marcus trusting me, and me trusting that Marcus's trust was real, and not just the shock of recent revelation wearing a kinder face. Neither of us said any of that out loud. We were both too old and too careful for that kind of declaration. But it was there. He said he would stay out of it. He did. The next weeks were the kind of weeks that don't make for good storytelling, but that are the actual substance of any real fight. Procedural, exhausting, and invisible to anyone on the outside. Reyes filed. Weston's attorneys responded. There were motions, there were counter-motions. There were phone calls I was kept informed about, and meetings I was not present at, and documents that traveled between law offices in ways that I had once, 30 years ago, understood the mechanics of, and now found I would have to relearn. I retained a financial advisor, a woman named Karen Liu, who came recommended by Priya from Rhea's office, and who had the particular quality of someone who explains complicated things to people without making them feel stupid for not already knowing. We had 3 meetings in 6 weeks to go through the structure of what I had inherited and what it meant practically. And at the end of the 3rd meeting, Karen set her pen down and said, "You have more options than you probably realize. I want to talk about what you actually want." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean the company, the assets, the portfolio. You've inherited a substantial set of things that require decisions. Not urgent decisions, but real ones. And some of my clients, when they come into something like this later in life, want to maximize value. Some want to liquidate. Some want to use it." She looked at me. "What do you want to do with it?" It was such a simple question, the kind that looks simple and isn't. I thought about the farmhouse. I thought about the walnut chair, which I had finished, and which was now sitting in the corner of the workroom, restored, complete, doing nothing because I had not decided yet what to do with it either. "I want to think about that," I said. "Good," Karen said. "Take your time. The decisions will keep." What I did in those weeks, while the legal machinery turned in the background, was something that I think surprised the people around me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. I started calling people. There were women I had known in the design industry, women who had been at various stages of their careers when I was at mine, some of whom had been affected by the events of 1999 in ways that had nothing to do with me, but that had nonetheless left marks. Women who had been associated with projects I'd worked on, whose professional reputations had been touched by the fallout from a story that turned out to be a lie. I didn't call them with any particular agenda. I called them because I wanted to hear their voices. Because I had been isolated for so long that the simple act of talking to someone who had known me when I was the person I actually was felt like drinking water after a very long dry spell. Some of them were surprised to hear from me. One woman, her name was Frances, she had been a project manager on the last major development job I'd worked before everything fell apart, actually gasped when I said my name. "Evelyn Carter," she said, and said it again, like she was making sure. "Where have you been?" "Texas," I said. "A farmhouse. Restoring furniture." "You're kidding." "I'm not." Frances laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that had warmth and disbelief and something like relief in it all at once. "I always wondered," she said. "I always thought the story they told about you didn't add up. I never said so publicly because—" She stopped. "Because I was younger and I was scared and I told myself it wasn't my business. I've thought about that a lot over the years." "You were in your 30s and you had a career to protect," I said. "I'm not angry with you." "You should be, a little." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm not. I'm just glad you're still around." Those conversations, 7, 8, 9 of them over those weeks, did something for me that nothing else had. They reminded me that there had been a before, that I had not always been the woman in the farmhouse, that the person I had been before 1999 had been real and known and valued, and that the story that had replaced her had not actually erased her. She had just been waiting, in Texas, restoring things. The legal case took its first real public turn in the month of June. Reyes called me on a Tuesday morning and said, "Weston's people have made an approach." His voice had a particular quality to it. Not excited. Reyes was not an excitable man, but alert in a different way than his usual professional steadiness. "What kind of approach?" I asked. "Settlement, pre-litigation." He paused. "The number they've offered is significant." He told me the number. I will not repeat it here. What I will tell you is that it was large enough that any reasonable person would have stopped to consider it seriously, and that I sat with it for 3 days before I told Reyes what I had decided. Patricia called during those 3 days. She called on Sunday, as always, and she could tell from the first 30 seconds of the conversation that something was happening. "Talk," she said. I told her about the offer. She was quiet for a moment. "What does Reyes say?" "He says it's my decision. He says the offer reflects their assessment of the strength of our case, that they wouldn't offer something this significant if they didn't believe we could win. But he also says that going to judgment would take longer, cost more, and carry risks that a settlement doesn't. But a settlement has confidentiality provisions," I said. "Standard practice. Sign the papers, take the money, agree not to discuss the specifics publicly." Patricia understood immediately. She always understood immediately. "Which means the story stays private." "Which means the story stays private." She was quiet again. "Ev," she said finally, "you've been living with this private for 23 years. "I know." "And the money?" "The money wouldn't change your life. You already have more than you need now." "I know that too." "So what you're actually deciding," she said, "is whether you want the record to be correct. Whether you want the people who might need to know what happened to be able to know it. Whether—" She paused, choosing words carefully the way she sometimes did when she knew the ones she'd landed on first were too sharp. "Whether you want the truth to be a thing that exists in the world, or just a thing that exists between you and the people in that conference room." I looked out the window at the lane. The pothole was still there. Dale's truck was parked in his driveway down the road, the same place it always was on Sundays. "Yes," I said, "that's what I'm deciding." "Then what do you want?" What I wanted was complicated. I will be honest with you about that. Part of me, the tired part, the 78-year-old woman with the arthritic knuckles and the bad back and the farmhouse and the quiet evenings, part of me wanted to take the money and go home and let the whole enormous thing be done. I had not asked for any of this. I had not asked for Dorothy's confession, or the 17 boxes, or the legal case, or the trips to New York, or any of the complications that had arrived in my life in the wake of that phone call from Marcus 4 months earlier. I had been at peace with my smallness. There is something to be said for peace with smallness, even if the smallness was imposed. But there was another part of me, the part that had spent 3 decades building things, the part that had stood up in 1999 and said, "I will carry this." The part that had made that decision out of love, misguided and exploited as that love turned out to have been. The part that had spent 23 years understanding, slowly and then all at once, that silence is only ever peace on the surface. That underneath it, silence is just a thing that buries other things and calls them gone. I called Reyes on Wednesday morning. "Decline the settlement," I said. A brief pause. "You're certain?" "Yes." "All right." I could hear him writing something. "I want to set expectations clearly. Once we decline this, the process will accelerate and the public dimension becomes more likely. Weston's firm will regroup and we'll hear from them again. But the next conversation will probably be at the discovery stage, and discovery in cases like this tends to generate attention. I understand, I said. Evelyn. He paused. Why? It was an unexpected question from a lawyer. Lawyers generally don't ask why. Because in 23 years, I said, I have met at least 3 women in this industry who lost something because of the story that was built around those events. Women who were newer in their careers, who were associated with projects I worked on, who got caught in the splash damage of a lie that was told about me. And there will be others I don't know about. I paused. The money stays in the building. The truth goes somewhere. I want it to go somewhere. Another pause. Okay, Reyes said quietly. He did not say anything else, but I heard in his voice the thing I had heard in Hargrove's voice when he talked about Dorothy. That careful respect for someone who has decided to do a hard thing and means it. The weeks after the declined settlement moved with a different energy. The legal machinery, which had been turning steadily in the background, shifted into a higher gear. Priya was on the phone more often. Robert, the quietly enthusiastic older colleague, began appearing at more meetings. There were depositions being scheduled, discovery requests being prepared, a calendar of procedure that Reyes's assistant sent me each week and that I read carefully and then filed in a folder on my kitchen table that was growing thick. Marcus called in the middle of all of it. Not about the case, he had kept his word and stayed out of it, but about something else. I'd like to come to Austin, he said, if that's all right. I held the phone. For how long? Just a weekend. I want to see where you live. That request, simple as it was, did something to me that I hadn't expected. Not the sentimentality of it. I am not a sentimental woman by nature. I have had too much of my life organized around disappointment to afford sentimentality freely. It was something more specific than that. It was the image of Marcus standing in the lane outside the farmhouse, seeing the pothole and the cedar tree and the workroom window and the back porch, and the specific ordinary texture of the life I had built in the years he had not been looking. I thought about whether I wanted him to see it. I thought about whether I was ready for what it would mean to have him stand in the same space that had been, for so long, entirely mine. Give me 2 weeks, I said. I have some things I need to do first. He said fine. He didn't ask what things. That itself was a kind of progress. The things I needed to do were mostly practical. The walnut side chair was done, and I had 4 other pieces in various stages of restoration that I wanted to clear space on. The back porch needed 2 boards replaced. I had been meaning to do it since winter and hadn't gotten to it. And I found, once I sat down with the thought of Marcus visiting, that I didn't want to be explaining damaged boards while also managing everything else. I fixed them myself over a weekend, badly and then adequately, with a YouTube tutorial and wood I bought at the hardware store in town, and more swearing than I will document here. Patricia called to tell me she was proud of me for declining the settlement. I don't know if proud is the right word, I said. It might turn out to have been stupid. It might, she agreed, but it wasn't small, and you've been small long enough. Being a little stupid in the direction of the truth seems fine to me. I thought about that for a day or two. Being a little stupid in the direction of the truth. Patricia had a gift for that, for finding the sentence that was slightly sideways from the way I'd been thinking, and that was somehow more accurate because of the angle. Weston's attorneys filed their first formal response on a Thursday in late summer. Reyes called me that afternoon and read me the relevant section, which characterized the claims as without merit and the documentation as incomplete and out of context, and a number of other things that were the legal equivalent of a man in a very expensive suit saying that never happened, and also it was a long time ago. How do we respond? I asked. With the documents, Reyes said. That's always been our answer. Everything Claudette built. That's the response. They can argue context and interpretation, but they can't argue with a contemporaneous internal email from November 1999 that shows Weston's client advising Richard Carter on exactly how to frame the liability attribution. That document alone is... He stopped. That document is significant. Good, I said. It's going to get harder before it gets easier, he said. I know. You've said that before. I'm saying it again because it's actually getting harder now, not just theoretically. I heard you the first time, David. A pause, then, unexpectedly, a sound that was almost a laugh. You know, in 20 years of practice, I have had very few clients who make me feel like I'm the one being managed. Is that a complaint? I asked. Not remotely, he said. Marcus came to Austin on a Saturday morning in early September. He rented a car at the airport. I had offered to pick him up, and he had said no. He'd rather drive himself, which I understood to be about needing the independence of the approach rather than anything complicated. And he pulled up the lane at 10:15 with the careful slowness of someone navigating an unfamiliar road and not wanting to hit the pothole. He hit the pothole anyway. He got out of the car and stood in the lane and looked at the farmhouse. He was wearing jeans and a shirt with no tie, which was the most casual I had seen him dress since he was a teenager, and he looked, standing in the morning light with the dry Texas grass around him, and the cedar tree behind him, and the particular quality of September light in that part of the state, warm, a little dusty, the sky very blue. He looked like someone who had arrived somewhere and wasn't sure what to do with having arrived. I came out onto the porch. We looked at each other. You fixed the boards, he said, looking at the porch. 2 weeks ago. They look good. They look adequate, I said. Come inside. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had been sitting when his call came in April, though he didn't know that. And he wrapped both hands around the mug and looked around the kitchen with its 1974 linoleum and its window above the sink and its folder of legal documents on the counter. This is where you've been, he said. This is where I've been. He nodded slowly, not with judgment, or if judgment was there, he was keeping it somewhere internal, where it belonged. It's quieter than I expected. It's always quiet, I said. That was the point. He looked at his coffee. Were you happy here? Before all of... He gestured vaguely in the direction of everything that had happened since April. It was a harder question than it sounded. I was at peace, I said carefully. That's not the same thing as happy, but it was real, and it was mine, and for a long time that was enough. And now? I thought about the legal folder on the counter. I thought about Reyes and the depositions and the declining settlement and the weeks ahead that would be harder before they were easier. I thought about Patricia and Frances and the other women I'd called, and about Claudette's 17 boxes, and about Dorothy's letter folded in the envelope in the drawer of my bedside table where I had put it after I came home and where it still was. Now, I said, is something different. Marcus stayed 2 nights. We did not have any dramatic conversations. We did not make any large declarations or arrive at any formal understanding of what we were to each other now, what shape the thing between us would eventually take. We ate dinner at the kitchen table both evenings. I cooked, which I had not done for company in years, and the meals were simple and imperfect, and Marcus ate them without complaint and said the chicken was good, which it was. We walked out to the workroom and I showed him the projects I was working on, and he stood in front of the finished walnut chair for a long time without saying anything, and then said, "You made this?" "Restored," I said. "Someone else made it, 80 years ago." "Still," he said. On Sunday morning, he came out to the back porch with his coffee and sat in the second chair, the one that was usually empty, and we watched the dry grass and the early light together in the kind of silence that is not the bad kind. Before he left, standing at his rental car with one hand on the door, he said, "I know this doesn't fix anything." "No," I said, "I know I can't give you back." He stopped. His jaw did the thing it did. "I know there's nothing I can actually give back." "Marcus," I said, "I know. I just want to be..." He looked up at the sky for a second and then back at me. "I want to be someone you can count on. That's what I want to be going forward. I don't know if I can make up for the rest, but I can do that." I looked at my son in the September light, 52 years old and in some ways still figuring out the most basic questions about who he wanted to be, which was not so different, I supposed, from most people, which was, if I was being honest, not so different from me. "Okay," I said, "then do that." He nodded, got in the car, drove carefully down the lane, missing the pothole this time. I stood on the porch and watched him go. The legal case continued its slow, complicated movement through the months that followed. There were developments I will not detail here because they are still, in some respects, ongoing, and because the specifics belong to the legal record and not to this story. What I will tell you is that by the time the first hard winter hit Austin, the kind that turns the grass gray and frosts the inside of the single-pane windows in the farmhouse, the shape of what was going to happen had become clear enough that Reyes called me on a December afternoon and said, in his careful, unhurried way, that he thought I should be prepared for a particular kind of outcome. "Tell me," I said. He told me. I sat in the kitchen with the frost on the windows and the legal folder thick on the table and listened to what 23 years of patience and 17 boxes of documents and one old woman's late-arriving courage had built. When he finished, I was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough?" I asked. "Evelyn," Reyes said, "it's everything." I put the phone down. Outside the window, the Texas grass was gray and the sky was low and flat, and the lane was empty in both directions. And somewhere down the road, Dale's truck was in its driveway, like always, and the whole world was very quiet. I sat there and I let it be quiet, because I had learned by then the difference between the quiet that buries things and the quiet that comes after something has finally been allowed to surface, to be named, to take up the space it was always owed. This was the second kind, and it felt, I will tell you honestly, nothing like I had imagined it would for 23 years. It felt harder and stranger and smaller and larger all at once, and more exhausting than triumphant, and more true than either of those things. It felt like the beginning of something I did not yet have the full shape of, and like the end of something I had been carrying so long I had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. The settlement conference was scheduled for the third week of February, 14 months after Marcus had called me from whatever expensive room he'd been standing in to tell me his grandmother was dead. Reyes called it a settlement conference. What it actually was, in practical terms, was the moment where Philip Garrett Weston and his attorneys sat across a table from me and my attorneys, and we negotiated the terms of how he was going to spend the rest of his professional life accounting for what he had done. The word settlement makes it sound mutual. It wasn't mutual. By February, after 14 months of discovery and depositions, and Priya's financial analysis, and Claudette's 17 boxes laid open in full documentary detail, there was nothing mutual about it. There was what Weston wanted, which was to make it go away, and there was what I wanted, which was something more specific than that. I flew to New York on a Sunday. Patricia drove me to the Austin airport, which she had not done before. She lived 40 minutes in the other direction, and the drive was not convenient, but she had called on Saturday evening and said, "I'm taking you to the airport," in the voice she used when the matter was not open for discussion. We drove mostly in silence, the way you do with someone you have known for 50 years, and with whom silence has long since stopped being uncomfortable and become instead its own form of conversation. The highway was empty in the early morning, the sky just beginning to go gray at the edges, and Patricia drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. About 20 minutes in, she said, without looking at me, "Are you scared?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. "I don't think so. I'm tired. I've been tired for months, but not scared." "Good," she said. Then a few miles later, "Are you ready?" "I've been ready for 23 years, I said. She reached over and put her hand on mine for just a moment. Then she put it back on the wheel. That was Patricia. That was enough. The conference was held in a neutral location, a conference suite in a midtown hotel, the kind of space designed to be inoffensive and to belong to no one, which is the point of a neutral location. Reyes and Priya and Robert were there before me. Weston arrived with 3 attorneys, which told me something about how they assessed the situation, because a confident man doesn't bring 3 attorneys to a settlement conference. I had met Weston once before, briefly, in the mid-1990s. I did not remember much about him from then. He had been peripheral to the world Richard and I moved in, a business associate of associates, the kind of man who appears at events and nods at the right people, and whose presence you register without cataloging. He was in his late 70s now, silver-haired, well-dressed, the kind of physical carriage that comes from having spent decades being treated like someone who matters. He did not look at me when he came in. That was the first thing I noticed. He looked at Reyes. He looked at the table. He looked at the hotel's inoffensive artwork on the wall. He arranged himself in his chair with his attorneys around him, and he did not once, in the first several minutes of the proceedings, look at me. I looked at him steadily. I had decided before I came that I was going to look at him because not looking was a form of concession that I was not prepared to make. Eventually, he had to look back. It was brief. A flicker. His eyes came to my face and then moved away, and in that flicker I saw something I had not expected to see. Not guilt. Guilt has a particular quality, a kind of inward turning, and this was not that. What I saw was something closer to the particular discomfort of a man who has constructed an entire internal narrative in which he was not the villain, and who has just been confronted with the person his narrative required to be invisible. I was not invisible. Reyes and Weston's lead attorney, a woman named Sandra Park, who was precise and formidable, and who I respected even though her job was to minimize what had been done to me, went back and forth for the first hour over procedural matters that I followed carefully and mostly understood, and occasionally had to lean over to Reyes to quietly clarify. The substance of it was this. The discovery process had produced documentation that neither side disputed in terms of its authenticity. The dispute was over its interpretation and its legal consequences. Sandra Park's position was that the document showed poor judgment and organizational dysfunction but did not rise to the level of deliberate fraud, that the statute of limitations arguments remained valid and contested, and that her client had spent decades contributing positively to the industry and the community, and that these proceedings were disproportionate. Reyes's position was contained in a single banker's box that Priya set on the table with a quietness that was itself a kind of statement. The November 14th memo, Reyes said. Sandra Park's expression did not change. She was too good a lawyer for that. But something shifted slightly in the arrangement of Weston's three attorneys, a micro-reorganization, the kind that happens when people who have been telling themselves a story realize someone else has the document that disproves it. The November 14th memo was a single page. An internal communication, 1999, from Weston to Richard, discussing in precise and unambiguous language exactly how the liability for the company's financial exposure was going to be attributed, to whom, and why attributing it to the existing narrative would be, as Weston had written, the cleanest solution given the alternative exposures. The cleanest solution. 23 years of my life described in 3 words. The cleanest solution. Priya had found it in Box 11, Folder 37, behind a divider labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence. Q4 1999. Claudette had preserved it in an archival sleeve. It was clear, complete, and Weston's name was on it in his own handwriting. Sandra Park asked for a recess after 20 minutes. She and Weston's team went into a side room. They were gone for 45 minutes. Reyes and I sat at the table and Priya poured water, and Robert looked at nothing with his usual contained expression, and nobody said very much because there was nothing useful to say. The memo had done its work. We were waiting for Weston to finish recalculating. Reyes leaned over at one point and said quietly, "How are you doing?" "Fine," I said. "Waiting. That's all this is right now. Waiting." "I've had practice," I said. He nodded, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. When Sandra Park came back, her face told me everything before she said a word. It was not defeat. She was too controlled for defeat to show openly. But it was the face of someone who had gone into that side room with an argument and come out with an instruction. The terms they offered in the second session were different from what they had offered before the memo was on the table. I will tell you the shape of what was agreed without the specific numbers, because the numbers are not the point. What was agreed was this: a formal acknowledgement in a signed document that would be filed with the court and therefore exist as part of the public record, that the attribution of responsibility for the 1999 financial crisis at Carter Design Associates had been inaccurate, and that Evelyn Carter bore no professional culpability for the events that had led to the company's losses. A financial settlement that Reyes and Karen Liu together described as appropriate to the scale of what had been taken, and a separate provision, the one I had insisted on, the one that had been the line I would not move from regardless of anything else, requiring the matter to be disclosed to the professional licensing board that governed Weston's firm in language that did not allow for minimization or contextualization. Sandra Park tried, 3 times, to negotiate that last provision down. I said no, each time, in exactly those words. She looked at me, after the 3rd time, with an expression that I could not entirely read. It was professional and contained, but there was something else in it, something that might have been a reluctant recognition of one woman for another in a room where the men were doing most of the arranging. My client would like to express, she began. No, I said. She paused. Whatever he would like to express, I said, he can express to the licensing board. That's what the provision is for. Weston looked at me then, full face for the first time since he'd walked into the room. He was old. I had thought about this man for 23 years in a way that had given him a particular kind of power, the power of someone who had done something to you and gotten away with it, which is a specific and corrosive kind of power. And now he was sitting across a table from me, and he was an old man with silver hair and 3 expensive attorneys and a November 14th memo that had undone the story he'd spent 23 years believing he'd buried. I looked back at him and felt nothing I needed to hide. He looked away first. The documents were signed at 4:17 in the afternoon. Reyes's assistant brought them in triplicate on a rolling cart. Sandra Park signed for Weston. Reyes signed for me. I signed for me. I watched my own handwriting, the slightly unsteady cursive of a 78-year-old woman with arthritic knuckles, not elegant, not the signature of someone trying to make an impression, move across the page, and I thought about Dorothy's precise and controlled handwriting in the letter she had sent me, and I thought, we were nothing alike, and we were not so different, and she did the wrong thing for a long time, and then she did the right thing too late, and I don't know what that makes her. Someone human. That's probably what that makes her. Reyes shook my hand when it was done. Priya, who was not a demonstrative person, put her hand briefly on my shoulder in a way that said what it said. Robert said, "Good outcome," which for Robert was practically a standing ovation. I walked out of the hotel and into the February cold of Midtown Manhattan, and I stood on the sidewalk and I called Patricia. She picked up on the 2nd ring. "Done," I said. The sound she made was not words, it was just a sound. But I had known Patricia for 50 years, and I understood it completely. "Come home," she said, when she could talk again. "Tomorrow," I said. "I have one more thing to do tonight." What I did that evening was simple. I took the subway, the first time I had taken the New York subway in over 20 years, which was disorienting in a strangely pleasant way. The particular smell and sound of it unchanged in ways that felt both like continuity and like being haunted by your own history. Uptown to the neighborhood where I had lived when I was the person I had been before 1999. The building was still there. Of course it was. Buildings like that don't go anywhere. The lobby looked the same, or close enough to the same that the differences were minor. There was a doorman who was not the doorman I had known, and the mailboxes had been updated at some point, and the carpet in the lobby was a different shade of what it had always been. I did not go inside. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, and I looked at the building for about 5 minutes. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe I was looking for the version of myself who had lived there, the woman who had been good at her work and in love with her husband and raising her son, and convinced that if you were honest and you worked hard and you loved the people around you adequately, the general shape of things would hold. I found her, standing there, or I found the space where she had been. And I thought, you were not wrong to believe what you believed. You were just wrong about who deserved it. Then I went back to the hotel and ordered room service and sat in bed and called Marcus. "It's done," I said when he answered. A pause. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I said. Really genuinely tired in a way that I think has been building for about 23 years and has just now found somewhere to land. "That sounds—" He stopped. "I don't actually know what that sounds like." "No," I said. "You wouldn't." A brief silence. Not hostile, just the silence of two people who are still learning how to be in conversation with each other after a very long absence. "Simone and I are having dinner at her parents' on Sunday," he said. "She asked if I'd mentioned it to you." That surprised me. Not the dinner, but the fact that Simone had asked. The fact that Marcus had apparently talked to Simone about me in a context where asking was a natural thing. "You've talked to her about me," I said. "A fair amount," he said. "Is that—" He paused. "Is that okay?" "Yes," I said. "That's okay." She said you were Another pause. "She said you reminded her of her own grandmother. She meant it as a compliment. Her grandmother was apparently terrifying." I laughed. It surprised me. The laugh came up faster than I was prepared for, the way things sometimes do when you have been very serious for very long and something ordinary and human catches you off guard. "Tell her I appreciate that," I said. I flew home the next morning. Austin in February is not warm exactly, but it is warmer than New York. And when I came out of the airport and the air hit me, it had that particular quality of a place that has let its winter be mild because it knows its summer will more than compensate. Patricia was waiting in the arrivals lane in her blue sedan, which she had driven since 2018 and which had a dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot incident she declined to discuss. She looked at me when I got in. Really looked. The way she always had, since we were girls. The way that said she was not looking at what you were presenting, but at what was actually there. "You look different," she said. "I'm tired," I said. "Not that," she said. "Something else." She pulled out of the lane and into the airport traffic. "You look like yourself." I did not say anything to that, but I sat with it the whole drive home. The flat Texas winter going past the window and Patricia driving in her careful way and the radio on low playing something neither of us commented on. And I thought, maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's the only way to describe what happens when you spend 23 years being someone else's version of yourself. And then one February afternoon in a midtown hotel conference room, you sign your name on a document that gives the right version back. You look like yourself. The spring came. The way spring comes to that part of Texas. Not gently, not gradually, but with a sudden insistence. The grass going from gray to green faster than seems reasonable. The air shifting in the space of a week from the flat cold of February to the particular warm thickness of March that is already gesturing at the heat to come. I finished the last piece in the workroom that I had been working on since before any of this started. A mahogany writing desk circa 1930s that had been in pieces when I bought it at an estate sale 2 years earlier. I had worked on it in the evenings and on weekends in the slow way that restoration work has to be done if you want to do it right, fitting it around everything else that had taken over my life. I set the completed desk in the corner of the front room where the light came through the window in the afternoon, and I stood back and looked at it. It was not perfect. The left rear leg had a repair that was slightly visible if you knew to look for it, and one of the drawer pulls was a replacement that was close to the original but not identical. It had a history. You could see it in the piece, the way you can always see history in something old if you're willing to look. The desk was not pretending to be new. That was fine. That was, in fact, the point. Karen Liu came to Austin in April. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and she walked me through what she had been calling the allocation decisions, what to do with the various components of what I had inherited, how to structure things going forward, what the practical landscape looked like now that the legal proceedings were concluded. It was a long conversation. I will give you the shape of it. The company, Carter Design Associates, the restructured, leaner version that had continued operating through all the years of my absence and of Dorothy's stewardship, I decided not to run. I was 78 years old, and I had been out of the design industry for 23 years, and the idea of stepping back into an executive role was not something I could approach with anything except honesty about my own limits. What I did instead was appoint a management board that included 2 people Reyes recommended, and one person I found myself, Francis. Francis, who had been a project manager in 1999, who had watched what happened and been too scared to say so, and who had spent the intervening years becoming a senior figure in the industry in her own right. I called her and I told her what I was offering. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you sure you want me?" Given that I didn't— "Francis," I said, "I'm asking you because of who you became, not because of who you were afraid to be at 32. She said yes. The investment portfolio Karen managed according to a plan we built together over 3 meetings, structured for what Karen called stability and purpose rather than growth for its own sake. I was 78. I did not need more growth. What I needed was the ability to do what I wanted to do with what I had. What I wanted to do was something I had been thinking about since the weeks after the will reading, since the phone calls with Frances and the other women, since the understanding had settled in me that the damage of 1999 had not been limited to me, that the lie had cast a shadow with a wider circumference than my own life. I established a fund, not large by the standards of the people who establish funds, not the kind of thing that gets a building named after it. Practical in scale, specific in purpose. It was designed to support women in the design and architecture industries who face professional displacement due to circumstances outside their direct control. Specifically, the kind of institutional failures and attribution manipulations that had been given a name in the legal proceedings and that turned out, once I started looking, to be depressingly common. There was a small grants component and a legal resources component and an advisory network component, which Frances said she would help run, and which Priya, who had moved to a new firm by then but stayed in touch, agreed to advise on the legal side. I named it the Claudette Initiative. Not for Dorothy, not for me. For the woman who had spent years in a New Jersey storage unit building a house of truth that I would someday need, whose name I did not know beyond what Dorothy had written in her letter, and who had done something essential and unglamorous and entirely invisible in the service of a justice she would never see. I thought that was right. I thought she deserved that. Marcus called when he heard about the fund. Not to comment on it, he had been careful, through all of this, not to offer opinions on my decisions unless I asked for them, which was a form of respect that I did not take for granted because it had taken clear effort. He called to tell me that Simone's firm, she was an architect I had learned, which I had not known on the day she sat silently in Hargrove's conference room, had a mentorship program for young women in the industry, and that if the Claudette Initiative ever wanted to partner with them, she would be interested in talking. I said I would call her. I did call her. We talked for over an hour. She was sharp and direct and asked good questions and did not defer to me unnecessarily, which I liked. She had built her own career and had her own understanding of the particular obstacles that women in design and architecture navigate, and she brought it to the conversation without making it about herself, which is a harder balance than it sounds. At the end of the call, she said tentatively, "Marcus has been, I think he's been trying." "I know," I said. "I can see that." "He talks about you more than he realizes he does," she said. "He probably wouldn't want me to tell you that." "Probably not," I said. A small silence. Then, "He's not the same as he was in April, last year, the man I met at the will reading." She paused. "I mean, he is, but something shifted, something in how he talks about himself and his family. He's working on something." "I know," I said again. "I can see that too." The summer was hot the way Texas summers always are, which is to say, fundamentally, structurally, non-negotiably hot, in a way that does not apologize for itself. I stayed in Austin. I worked in the early mornings before the heat settled in fully, and in the evenings when it began to ease, and in the middle of the day I stayed inside and read and talked to the people I was building back into my life. Patricia came for a week in July. She slept in the back bedroom and we ate meals at the kitchen table and walked in the mornings when it was still bearable, down the county road and back, and she asked questions about the fund and about Marcus and about Frances and about how I was sleeping, and I answered them all honestly because that is what Patricia and I do. On the last evening before she went home, we sat on the back porch with iced tea. The same place I had been sitting alone for years, but different now with the second chair occupied, and watched the sun go down over the dry grass. "Are you happy?" she asked. The same question she had asked on the way to the airport in February. This time the answer was different. "Yes," I said. "I think so. Not the way I was happy before everything. That was a different life, and I don't think you get the same happiness twice. It changes shape when it comes back." I looked at the grass going orange in the evening light. "But yes, something that I think qualifies." Patricia nodded. She sipped her iced tea. She looked at the same sunset I was looking at. "Good," she said. "You took long enough. I want to talk to you directly now. I have been telling you this story for a long time, and we have been in it together, and I think you deserve more than the ending. I think you deserve the thing underneath the ending. I am 79 years old now. The story I have told you happened in the year between one spring and the next, and I am on the other side of it, in the farmhouse, in the particular September light that was here when Marcus came to visit and that has come back around the way light does. The walnut chair sits in the corner of the workroom. The mahogany desk is in the front room. There are 3 new pieces waiting on the bench that I have not started yet, and a folder of Claudette Initiative correspondence on the kitchen table that is thicker every week. I want to tell you what I learned, not because I think my life is instructive in the way that tidy fables are instructive. It isn't tidy. It hasn't been tidy. It will not be tidy going forward. But because I think there are things in what happened to me that are not unique to me. Things you might have felt. Things you might be living with right now. The first thing is this. Silence is not the same as peace. I spent 23 years believing they were the same. I retreated into a quiet life and I called it healing, and some of it was. But some of it was also just fear wearing a more dignified name. I was afraid that the truth would cost me more than the lie had, because the lie had already cost me nearly everything, and at a certain point your capacity for loss runs very low and you stop risking. I am telling you, the truth cost me more than the lie did in the short term. It was exhausting and public and full of procedural indignities, and it took 14 months and I was 78 years old doing it, which is not ideal timing. But here is what the truth did not do. It did not leave me alone in a farmhouse asking for nothing. It did not let the wrong story be the last one told. It did not allow the people who had used me to go on benefiting from a version of events that erased me from my own life. The silence would have allowed all of those things. The silence would have called it peace and let them keep what they had taken. I am done with that kind of peace. The second thing, dignity is not something other people give you. I waited 23 years for someone to restore my dignity to me, Richard, or Dorothy, or Marcus, or the industry, or time itself, or just the general movement of things toward fairness that we tell ourselves exists. None of them restored it. Dorothy came closest at the end, and I am grateful for that, but I want to be clear. What Dorothy did was give me the tools to restore it myself. The documents, the evidence, the legal foundation. She built me a means. I had to use it. Your dignity is yours. It was always yours. The people who disrespected it did not actually take it. They obscured it. They buried it under their version of events. They pressured you and lied about you and made you doubt whether you deserved it. But it was always there. And you have the right to go dig it back up, even if it's hard, even if it's late, even if people tell you it's not worth the trouble. It is worth the trouble. I promise you it is worth the trouble. The third thing is harder to say, and I'm going to say it anyway. I was not perfect in what happened to me. I made choices that contributed to my own erasure. I agreed to carry something that wasn't mine to carry, and I told myself it was love. And some of it was love. But some of it was also a woman who had been taught that keeping the peace was her responsibility, that the family's stability was worth her truth, that being good meant being quiet. I had absorbed those lessons so deeply that when the moment came, I enacted them without fully choosing them. I participated in my own silencing. That is a hard thing to know about yourself. I am not telling you this to add guilt to what was already a painful accounting. I am telling you because I think a lot of us do this, particularly women, particularly in families, particularly in professional environments where we are already working harder than we should have to just to be taken seriously. We make accommodations. We absorb unfairness. We call it grace, and sometimes it is grace. And sometimes it is just learned helplessness that has found a more palatable name. Know the difference. That's what I'm asking. Know when you are choosing patience and when you are choosing fear and when you are choosing to make yourself smaller than you are because someone taught you that was the right size. Because those 3 things look identical from the outside and they feel very similar from the inside, and only one of them is actually serving you. The fourth thing, forgiveness is not a destination. It is not a box you check, and then the feeling resolves and you move on cleanly. I have not forgiven everyone involved in what happened to me. I have made a kind of peace with Richard that is not forgiveness, but is something An acknowledgement that he was a flawed person who failed me in a specific and consequential way, and who also loved me, and that both of those things are true and neither cancels the other out. I have made a different kind of peace with Dorothy, which is also not forgiveness, but is gratitude for what she finally did and grief for what she took so long to do. Marcus is something ongoing, still being built, and I have learned not to name it too early because naming things too early is how you end up managing a label instead of a relationship. I have not forgiven Weston. I want to be honest about that. He sat in a conference room and let his attorney negotiate his accountability in the most limited terms available to him, and he looked at me exactly once, and what I saw in his face was not remorse. It was calculation. He was calculating even then what this was going to cost him and how to minimize it. He was not looking at me and seeing a person he had wronged. He was looking at a problem he was being forced to manage. I'm not going to tell you that I found a way to release that. I haven't. What I have done is decide that what he carried out of that room was his to carry, and that what I carried out of that room was something else entirely, and that I was done being responsible for the weight of his accounting. That is not forgiveness. It is something more practical. It is just deciding that someone else's failure to reckon with themselves is not going to live in my chest for the rest of my life because I gave it a more generous name than it deserved. That has been enough for me. Maybe it will be enough for you if you have someone like that in your life. The fifth thing, and the last thing, is about love. I spent a long time, most of my adult life, believing that love was demonstrated through sacrifice, that love meant carrying what was heavy, that love meant staying quiet when you needed to speak, and making yourself smaller when you were in the way, and absorbing damage so that others didn't have to. I learned this from my family and from my marriage, and from a professional world that rewarded women who were useful and punished women who were inconvenient. And I learned it so thoroughly that I stopped noticing I was doing it. But here is what I know now, having lived the full shape of this. Love that requires your erasure is not love. It is a transaction. It is someone else's comfort purchased at the price of your truth, and the purchasing party will not thank you for it because they cannot. Because thanking you would require acknowledging what was taken, and people who take rarely want to acknowledge the taking. Marcus sat on my back porch in September and said, "I want to be someone you can count on." That is love. Imperfect, late, still figuring itself out, but real. It did not cost me anything. It did not require me to be smaller. It asked me to be exactly as present as I was, with everything I had been through, and to extend the same to him. That is what love actually looks like. Not sacrifice. Presence. Not erasure. Witness. I wish someone had told me that 40 years ago. I am telling you now. The walnut chair I restored in the workroom, the one I had been sanding the morning Marcus called, the one I finished while the legal case was still being built, I kept it. I had thought when I bought it that I would restore it and sell it the way I had sold other pieces. But when it was done, I moved it to the back porch, to the spot where the second chair had always been empty, and it fits there in a way that feels right, in the unsentimental way that good furniture fits a space, not because it was designed for it, but because the proportions are correct and the material is honest, and both the chair and the space have been through enough that they don't need to perform anything for each other. Patricia sits in it when she visits. Marcus sat in it in September. Sometimes I sit in it myself when I want to look at the yard from a different angle than usual. A repaired thing is not the same as an unbroken thing. I want to be clear about that. The repair is part of what it is. You can see it if you look. The chair has been broken and mended, and it holds a person's weight just fine, and it will keep doing so for another 80 years if it's treated with reasonable care. That is not despite the repair. It is in some way I am still working out how to articulate because of it. The repair is the proof that someone thought it was worth the work. I thought I was worth the work. That took me a long time to believe and longer to act on, and it cost me more than it should have and less than it used to feel like it cost. And I am telling you now, from the back porch of a farmhouse in Texas, with the September light doing what September light does, and the yard quiet, and the second chair occupied and the folder of Claudette Initiative correspondence on the kitchen table, and Reyes's number in my phone, and Patricia calling on Sundays, and Marcus answering when I call. I was worth it. You are worth it. Whatever has been buried, whatever wrong story has been told about you, whatever weight you have been carrying that was never yours to carry, you are worth the work of recovering it. You are worth the trouble of insisting on your own truth. You are worth the exhaustion of a long fight and the discomfort of speaking when you have been taught to be quiet, and the terrifying vulnerability of taking up the space that is actually, rightfully yours. Don't wait 23 years. Don't wait for someone else to correct the record. Don't let the people who built a lie on top of your life go on benefiting from it because the truth feels too heavy to lift. It is heavy. I won't lie to you about that. It is very heavy. But you have been carrying the wrong weight for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to carry something that is actually yours. And yours is lighter than you think. Yours is the weight of the truth, and the truth, once you stop running from it, turns out to be something you can hold. I know because I held it. In a conference room on a February afternoon, I held it, and I am still here. The sun is going down over the dry grass. The air is warm and a little dusty, and the sky is the particular dark blue that means the real dark is maybe an hour away. Somewhere down the road, Dale's truck is in the driveway. The cedar tree in the lane is doing what cedar trees do. The workroom window is lit because I left the light on, which I do sometimes, just because the light looks like something from the road. I am 79 years old. I am a woman who spent 23 years being forgotten and 14 months being remembered. And I am still here in my farmhouse, with my coffee going warm, and my sister calling Sunday and my son answering Thursday, and my work waiting in the morning, and my name on a document in a courthouse in New York that says, in the careful and official language of a system that is slow and imperfect and sometimes right, that Evelyn Carter was never the woman they said she was. She was always the woman she was. And now everyone knows it.